Yeah, you ever find yourself? Okay, we're not. I don't want to go that far. So I wanted to keep talking about my boy, Edwin Black, because discovering this guy has been a wild ride from my perspective, just because of what I'm currently looking into. Because I wanted answers, you know? Sometimes you gotta ask the ethereal answers. And sometimes they lead you to people, and then, and then you just, like, run away. Um, yeah, why isn't this going? Hello, did I break this? So the British in the 1700s. I should. Yeah, that is weird. I was just playing this part.
And thank you very much for coming.
Arigatou gozaimasu.
One guy called for sure involved. I had about 30 researchers, genocide, the conflict and commerce and conquest of that troubled land.
I probably should have wrote down the time.
For 2,600 years.
Well, either way. He basically describes that at some point in time during his research and researching the Middle East from a historical perspective, he just decided to like research the entire continent's time period. But there are very few key things that I want to focus in on. And let me just turn off the web browser here. And I wrote a bit. I wrote a bit. I don't know why I'm so nervous. The heart's palpitating. Which is why I called the stream "The Architect versus Nature." In this case, I don't know if you can hear the ambulance sirens. The architect, special interest groups. Where was I going with this? So Edwin Black, in that portion of time, which I pretty sure I put the link to the video in the description and the time period that kind of starts where I want to talk about. He basically describes that ultimately what happened to the Middle East and the fate of which, moving forward, what ended up happening was the British invaded. They had an agenda to what would happen to the Middle East. They spoke to the Arabs. They created a deal with the Arabs. That ultimately didn't go through. There was like a United Nations meeting, which I have the document to somewhere on the web browser. I don't know if I want to pull that up. We'll do that later. Basically, it's just a kind of like the written up proposal at the United Nations where it describes that on this day, the British give the rights to the Middle East to France, And this is a very famous war. It's called the Franco-Syrian War. It's most famous for its first altercation of tanks against horseback riders. So essentially, the French overwhelmingly won all of those altercations. Of course, they were going up against people who were still using like swords, horseback, and all this other stuff. So, of course, they lost. Thus creating Lebanon, because these were loose tribes. Edwin Black says that these were just loose tribes. They became incorporated as states under French rulership, which, like, essentially all they were after was the oil, the resources. And it got me to think, because at the end of the day, most wars only like benefit the imperialist aspect of like European financial sector groups. You know what I mean? That's what I call special interest groups, because normally it's like you need a lot of money in order to finance a lot of these things. So what can I say? Yeah, it's dangerous. Like, I was reading some of the names, which is why I don't want to play the Edwin Black video, because that's when you get a little too far. They like letting you talk about an issue. They like letting you loosely like associate the issue, because they understand that by a large degree, even if this video is found by anybody, as long as I don't mention any names that you can Google and then you can go further research into it, like, they won't necessarily care. And even then, you know, they've dumbed down the populace enough to not actually allow anybody that, or entertain the idea of like, yeah, I'm actually gonna go take the time out of my day and research this bullshit. Nobody really does that, and the only people that do are people who write books. America is caught in a war, right? So this entire altercation, if you read what it says in the United Nations papers, it basically says they wanted to create a pipeline. Where did they want to make this pipeline? Syria. Oh my. Where does this... How did this all, like... How did we get here again? You know what I mean? Like, wait a minute. The problem with Syria right now is a pipeline. You're telling me back in, like, the early 1900s, it was about a pipeline? So this issue has been... It's been a reoccurring theme. So essentially, during this time, World War I happened, and my guess is the imperialists, people who were in these positions of power that allow them the leisure and the capabilities to either hire think tanks, or they have the leisure to actually think this sort of thing out, because, you know, resources are very valuable, especially raw resources. And if you look at if we look at timeline-wise and where we are at now, oil was a very essential thing. Like, if you have any plastic product near you, more than likely that oil came from the Middle East. So it is very weird for how all this progressed. So, right, this deal was facilitated by the British and the Arabians at first. That didn't plan out. Then they sold it to the French, and the French were like, don't worry, we'll get all these fools in line. And by the time that happened, they had already took over, or at least they set up these fake kings, these fake sultans, to sign land rights. Because essentially, they wanted to facilitate this so it's legal. So if it ever came to dispute, like, there are ownership rights to the land, ownership rights to whatever factories they set up. They wanted to own things legally, right? They wanted to do things their way, you know, play their game. And during this, Edwin Black specifically states the names of the documents that I'm talking about. But what's really interesting about this is his reference. He does not call this a Jewish deal. He calls this a Zionist deal. And I thought that was very interesting of him to be very mindful of the verbiage that he was using. Right, because I call Israel PTSD land. Like, you visit there for the sole purpose for you to experience aspects of level of trauma. So when you go there, you sympathize with them, and when they come back here, they align with whatever special interest lobby groups they already have on the state side. So, you know, it perpetuates the cycle of lobbying groups, and it perpetuates the cycle of the exercise of political power, at least here in America. Where is it? Well, I said, then the French came in, the Franco-Syrian War, horse versus tanks. So this all connects to one of the largest spells. I would say that, I don't know how to say it. This is why I called it the architect versus nature, because when was this plan hatched? Like, I find it very difficult to believe that, right, this is 1925, give or take. So World War I was already had. Like, it was in the minds of these upper echelon people that America was a workhorse. They did have good soldiers, right? Like, there were aspects of them that understood that it was untapped potential. I think a very famous quote from the time was, America is a sleeping giant. So they were, or at least by and large part, they were very unaware of the sort of resources that they had. And I think it's why America's growth has been stunted. People like to say that America is like at the forefront of developing blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, Nah, not really. Like most of the land has been sold to foreigners. They have no interest in developing any of the land. They have no interest in developing any of the infrastructure. There's no, you know what I mean? Like, you got to jump through a lot of hoops to believe that this country has any sort of efficiency put behind it. Well, I said yeah, just connecting it to the World Trade Centers. Yeah, it just gets back to when was that planned, and you know, how do you? Why would you? So many questions run through my head. Like, were the buildings just a coincidence? Was just one of the dudes that was in one of these meetings like, hey, we could use my building? Or was that building decided on from the very beginning? But if you look at some of the, like, how early the programming was and how early that they were putting the imagery in front of you, right? Television shows, movies, like Neo's passport being 9/11, like, there must have been some level of aspect of like skull and bone or like thuggery where this was largely known about, was planned about. Like I would largely assume that this was planned out by the best of men, because I think largely the beast system has degraded to where it is now because the quality of men is different, right? Like a 1920s individual who's working for these special interest groups handles himself very like cut, bold, and dry. Like decisions are made. Meanwhile, their sons and daughters or their descendants who are controlling the system now are very indulgent in whatever vice they have. But again, you know what I mean? Like one group of faction degraded while another one rose. So it all depends on how you see it. Yeah, I just wanted to connect this video to like how the Franco-Syrian War is some of the underpinnings of where we are now with the war in the Middle East, with the Middle East always being a point of contention, point of control, and the only people that really benefit from this are the Europeans. There is no real, right? Like there's no real rhyme or reason for all of this to be where it is now, because we know that 9/11, or at least I believe that it was staged completely. Now looking into this Franco-Syrian war stuff, I'm like, I don't know how deep this goes, but this goes deep. Like, you know what I mean? Because they knew what they were doing in large part. They were playing their chess game. They were largely setting up these pieces in order for theater, or a sort of theater, to play out in the minds of men, to allow them to completely and willingly co-opt themselves into this altercation. Really, really heavy stuff when I was thinking about all this. Yeah, I'm gonna keep that loose. I don't even want to name anything else because, you know, you can Google it yourself. You could see who sat at this UN meeting. You can see the name of the Sultan who signed away the land deed of Palestine. Then Edwin Black, if you watch that video that's linked in the description, he also describes and he names the groups that filed for ownership of the land rights of Palestine in England by like, and he points to the paperwork. So I'm just kind of piggybacking off of him because, right, I'm looking at the larger scale. I'm looking at what were the decisions made by these special interest groups and how can I reverse engineer what could have possibly happened during that time by looking at what conclusions we have now. So, right, I could just look at the war in the Middle East and see the ramifications that have occurred, but I can also look at the past and be like, oh, these were the underpinnings. Like, this is where it all got set up. This is where decisions were made by these families, oligarchs, whatever we want to call them, imperialists. You know what I mean? These were dominoes. Like, you can't just, you gotta set them all up. I don't know how else to explain that. Then I'm gonna jump into another video right now. So, I'm Ramirez, Rami. Hi. I don't know.